All right, we're starting our final unit on linkage institutions. So we're going to be talking about elections, campaigns, political parties, interest groups, and the media. So what are linkage institutions? So political parties, interest groups, the media, elections, these are all ways to connect individuals to the government. So for example, in an election, you as an individual are going to be able to vote for the person that you want to represent you in government. Okay, so that election is linking you to the government. So linkage institutions are going to provide individuals with different forms of political participation. So ways that they can participate within the government. So elections are going to give us that opportunity to vote, choose our representatives. Other forms of political participation include calling, emailing, or contacting officials via social media, working on or donating to a political campaign, or joining some sort of social movement. So before we get into elections and talking about elections, let's first hit on the expansion of voting rights. So voting requirements are going to be set by states. So voting requirements might vary state to state, but they are subject to constitutional requirements and federal law. So 5 of the 17 amendments to the Constitution are going to expand suffrage or voting. So we've already talked about the 15th and 19th Amendment, which gives African American men and then women the right to vote. The 17th Amendment is going to provide for the direct election of senators. Okay, so you're able to cast a vote for the person that you want to represent your state in the Senate. The 24th Amendment, as we've said before, outlaws poll taxes. And then the 26th Amendment is going to lower the voting age from 21 to 18. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about factors that shape electoral participation. So when we're talking about elections, we have to look at the people who are actually voting in these elections. So large percentages of Americans actually don't vote. So in the 2016 presidential election, only 58% of Americans actually voted in that election. So that's just a little bit more than half. Voter turnout, okay, is going to be defined as the number of eligible voters who participate in an election as a percentage of the total number of eligible voters. So voter turnout is going to be studied in terms of the health of democracy. So when we're talking about voter turnout, it can be calculated in some different ways. So we said the voting eligible population. Sometimes they'll look at it as registered voters or the voting age population. So all people who are old enough to vote. Now, voter turnout is generally going to be lower in midterm elections or in primary elections than it is in a presidential election. So turnout is generally going to be the highest for a presidential election. So what causes a person not to vote? So sometimes it's actually shaped by state laws or election procedures. Again, like I just said, a presidential election is going to have more turnout or higher turnout than other types of elections. And then turnout can also vary by demographic characteristics. So we're going to get into some of the different demographic characteristics and how those characteristics can affect voter turnout. So the first is socioeconomic status and education. So socioeconomic status is defined as the measure of a person's wealth, income, occupation, and educational attainment. So people who have a higher socioeconomic status are going to be more likely to vote and more likely to participate in politics in general. So they're more likely to participate in elections, to donate to campaigns, associate with interest groups. And a lot of that is because education is going to lead to a higher income, which makes the voting registration process easier and more likely. So a higher education level is going to be the factor that is most associated with voting participation. Okay, so highly educated people are going to be less intimidated by the voting process. Again, if they have a higher income, then they're going to have that ability to get to where they need to be to register to vote, to actually participate in the election process. Next is political efficacy. So This is defined as one's belief that voting is an effective way to influence the world. So a person with a strong sense of political efficacy is going to feel that their vote will make an impact. Okay, and higher levels of education can increase that political efficacy or the confidence that he or she can make a political change. So if you believe that your vote is really going to count, that it really matters, then you're going to be more likely to participate in an election. Next is age. So there's a strong correlation between age and voting participation. Young adult voting eligible Americans tend to vote at lower rates than members of older generations. So older people are generally going to have the highest voter turnout, whereas lower or younger people are going to have a lower voter turnout. So age is connected to both income and education. Okay, so older people are more likely to have wealth, higher levels of income. Okay, older people are also going to have concerns about things like mortgages, their children, retirement, Social Security, and therefore are going to be really invested in public policy because it affects their lives. Whereas younger people might not have developed that strong political views yet, or they might not feel like they really have any kind of stake in the outcome. Voting can also be a challenge for younger generations. So, for example, if you're a college student and you live away from home, you're going to have to cast an absentee ballot or maybe drive back home to vote, and that just makes the whole process a lot more difficult. So, older people are more likely to have a higher voter turnout than younger people. Next is racial and ethnic identities. So historically, race is going to correlate significantly with voter turnout. Whites have historically had the highest turnout rates. The turnout rates between whites and African Americans, however, has narrowed in recent years. Okay, so African American turnout rate has actually risen to within 2 to 3 percentage points of the white turnout rate. However, the turnout rates of Hispanics is lower than other racial and ethnic identities. Okay, so it's significantly lower, but that could shift with age. Next is gender. Okay, so men and women tend to vote at similar rates, although in recent decades, women have voted at a rate that is just slightly higher than men. So since that 1980 election, women have voted a little bit more than men have. However, voting patterns can shift based on race and age. Okay, so in the 2012 election, there was a 9% difference in voter turnout between African American men and women. All right, another thing that can lead to voter turnout are the characteristics of the candidate. Okay, so race and gender might be a factor. So more African Americans turned out to vote for President Obama, whereas more women turned out to vote for Hillary Clinton. Military service is generally going to be viewed as a positive trait. So if a candidate formally served in the military, generally people are going to look at that as a good thing. Most people aren't going to care whether or not a candidate went to some sort of prestigious school or what religion he or she practices or what his or her sexual orientation is. So in general, people are more concerned with their policy views than their background. However, people do look at appearance. So candidates want to portray a positive, confident image. So some things that can affect voter turnout would be negative campaigning, so attacking your opposition or even the government itself. So that could affect whether or not voters turn out. And then just the overall trust in government. Next is partisan attachment. So if an individual belongs to a party, so maybe they're a member of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, they're going to be more likely to vote. Okay, this political mobilization is defined as efforts by political parties to encourage their members to vote. And sometimes political mobilization can be really decisive in an election. Okay, so if you're part of a political party, you're going to be more likely to vote. And political parties try to get members of their party to vote through political mobilization. All right, and last we have legal and institutional factors. Okay, So this is where we're going to talk about convicted felons, because state laws vary on whether or not convicted felons can vote. So they have different rules regarding the eligibility. Some states are going to reinstate the right to vote when a felon has finished serving his or her parole. Some states require mandatory lifetime disenfranchisement, meaning that felons are not allowed to vote ever. States can have different registration requirements for who can vote and how ballots can be cast and where a person may go. So opportunities for registration could be when you're renewing a driver's license. Some states allow online registration. Some are going to allow registration at the polls. So that can vary and affect whether or not people are able to vote. In most states, voters are going to have to register before an election, often as far out as 30 days. In some states, to register, you're going to have an ID or proof of residency in that state. Okay, so stricter voter identification laws are going to reduce voter turnout. Less restrictive requirements are also going to be associated with higher turnout. And then there are elections that are held on a Tuesday, the fact that they are. So this is going to be a work day for many people. So Tuesday elections in the United States are going to make it difficult for working people to get to the polls, okay? However, states are increasingly allowing voters to cast absentee ballots, okay, which might help to take care of that burden of in-person weekday elections. All right, and that's where we're going to stop with this video.